I've known many great people over the years that I'll never forget, and sometimes what people may remember you for or the memory that you leave behind may not be what you wish it was. One fellow in particular was a very good man, and I have nothing bad to say about him, but what most people remember about him was probably not ideal. Every time he would talk, he would tell you about every ailment that he has, and to hear this man speak, you expected him to just shatter into pieces at any moment. But now that I say that, I wonder how people will remember me later in life. Will it be for complaining, things that I've done for others, whether good or bad? That is something for all of us to ponder here. Now, I know this will be a terrible illustration, but think about the way that our Creator placed your eyeballs in their sockets. If your pupils were on the back side, you would be looking at yourself all the time. Some of you might have just rolled your eyes hard enough right now you did manage to see your brain. But our eyes were placed forward to see others, and that means our focus should be on others. Yes, take care of yourself, but the majority of the time, we should be looking outward and we should be looking upward. Peter just finished saying in the two verses from our last study, in chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, above all, keep fervent love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaint. This was said to a body of believers that was going through trouble that was much fiercer and more intense than most of us will ever experience. These people were being killed for their faith. Their loved ones were being taken and killed. Everything they had was confiscated. Homes, properties, everything. They were literally fugitives on the run, trying to hide from a wicked and cruel emperor. And through Peter, God is instructing them not to dwell on their issues, but to have hope, and to be a sign of hope and comfort to all those around them. This same wicked ruler, Nero, would soon take the life of the Apostle Peter himself, as well as Paul. And both of these men spent their lives serving God by serving others. And they both tell us in the epistles that they wrote to focus on doing the same. Everybody suffers in this life to some extent. Some people face more difficult trials than others, whether in their bodies or something else within their life. The problems that we face are real, and we should do what we can about them. But when those things are out of our hands, you give those to the Lord, trusting that He is good. And then we start looking for ways to show those around us that our God is good. And the most memorable way to do that is to serve God by serving them. Our lesson today begins in 1 Peter chapter 4. We'll start with verses 10 and 11. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Whoever speaks is to do so as one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. Though most people don't really realize it, we are all gifted by God in some way, and it's always done in a way that should not put us in the spotlight, but instead should glorify God. Paul, when he was known as Saul of Tarsus, was not someone that you would think of as a Christian leader. I mean, after all, he's responsible for the death of many Christians, but God turned that persecutor of the faith into a preacher of the faith who would give his life for the gospel, literally. And then Peter was a simple fisherman until Jesus came into his life, and look at the things that God did through that man, things that he would not be capable of doing on his own. Look at how even the leaders of that day were left stunned by the disciples in Acts chapter 4, verse 13. Now, as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were amazed and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. God has given you abilities and gifts. The Bible tells us that everyone has at least one. Also in the Bible, we'll find lists of some of the spiritual gifts that God gave to us. Some of the gifts given to believers today include those things, but it's not limited to those. Things like discernment, evangelism, exhortation, faith, giving, healing, helping, hospitality, knowledge, leadership, mercy, serving, teaching, preaching, and wisdom. These are just but a few of the things. And every believer has at least one of the spiritual gifts, and many are not even sure which one that they have yet. But the gifts that our Lord gave us are not limited to any list in the Bible. Some people are blessed enough to help others in time of financial need, or they support a ministry or a foundation of some kind. God has blessed them with financial well-being, and they in turn are good stewards of that gift. Some people are gifted musicians in multiple instruments. I never read where piano playing was a spiritual gift in any list of the Bible, but God certainly has blessed some people with the ability to play that instrument beautifully. And when they use that gift to serve their church, the service just feels fuller and richer, and God is glorified through that gift. Some people are blessed with a great singing voice. I am not one of those people for sure. But the ones that are, when they use it to make music that brings glory and honor to God, and they sing songs of praise to Him, they're great examples of stewards with their gifts. Gifts do not always have to be an ability or a blessing like wealth or talent. Sometimes a gift can be a responsibility that is precious to you and precious to God. Your spouse, if you are married, is a gift. Mine definitely is. What kind of steward are you being with the gift that God gave to you if you are a married person? That word steward that Peter used in verse 10 implies that we do not own the thing that we are stewards of. It belongs to someone else, and we are charged with the care of that thing. My wife belongs to God, as I do, but I don't want to stand before Him and give an account of me being a poor steward to the spouse that He gave me. After all, Jesus died for her too. She is precious in His sight. As stewards of the many things that God has richly blessed us with, we better realize the serious responsibility that comes with these gifts. Whatever your gift or gifts are, remember that it is not to be about you. Peter made that clear in the previous chapter when our responsibilities as husbands and wives were laid out. In verse 11, he adds all the other spiritual gifts are also about God, not us. Whether you speak or you serve in some other fashion, it should be done with God's word and in the strength and the ability that He provides. The purpose of all these blessings are not to elevate us. They're not to make us popular or anything selfish like that. These purposes are to glorify God and to serve Him. Something about the gifts He gives makes it obvious to the recipient that they didn't do that on their own. God specializes in using the least likely candidates for a job. He turned fishermen and tax collectors into worldwide evangelists and church planters. Their deeds ended up being memorialized for us to study for examples. Everyone always thinks of Samson in the Bible as this big muscled up man. Almost every cartoon or painting or picture shows a big Hercules type guy. We don't know for sure, but it's highly possible that Samson may not have been. Regardless of his size, it's obvious that his power far outseated his body type. If Samson were some kind of hulkish bodybuilder built like Sylvester Stallone, there would be no reason for the Philistines to ask what's the secret of his strength. In Judges 16:5, the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, "Entice him and see where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." When someone is blessed with something that they clearly did not develop or accomplish on their own, it should be obvious that God did that, and then the glory easily goes to Him. That's why He blesses people, so many people with things or talents that are unusual, or calls people that they would most likely be the last ones picked to do a job. After all, look at Amos, a simple farmer sent to confront powerful kings and wicked leaders. Contrary to what you might think, many of the people that you hear preaching and teaching the Word of God would have never imagined doing that. It may not show on the surface, but some of them can be really big introverts. The thought of speaking publicly to any size crowd might terrify them, but God does it through them, and to Him be the glory. Let's go on into verses 12 and 13. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so also at the revelation of His glory you may rejoice with exultation. We shouldn't be surprised when we suffer, but so many times we are. Every one of us thinks that we will never be sick again, or the diagnosis will never be given to us. That police officer will never knock on our door with bad news. Whatever scenario we think we are somehow immune to. When things are going well for any length of time, we'll slip and forget that we live in a fallen and cursed world. This is not heaven yet. Ever since Genesis chapter 3, bad things happen in this world, and they happen to everyone. Just because you're a Christian does not mean that you are exempt from suffering or from sickness. In fact, that may mean an increase in the amount of suffering when you factor in persecution. The world is going to try to devour those who refuse to conform to it. Jesus told us that in this world we will have suffering. He definitely suffered while He was here. Expect to share in the sufferings of Christ, and never forget that this world is not your permanent home. We are citizens of heaven. The best is yet to come. The day is coming when we will receive a body that will never age, that will never get sick, it will never die. Then and only then can we expect smooth sailing. At the same time, it's tragic when you think of all the lost people in this world. As bad as things are with pain, heartache, loss, for those who are not saved, this is it. This is the best their existence will ever be. Can you imagine ever being in such torment that you actually miss being on this cursed, miserable planet? The man Jesus spoke of in Luke chapter 16 definitely did. Now, Peter called this a fiery trial. I don't know about you, but it sure seems much better to endure a little bit of fire now than to have to endure it for eternity. A little bit of suffering now with eternal bliss awaiting you. Or you can call this mess good enough and endure fiery trials forever. Let us continue on into verses 14 through 16. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. Peter mentioned earlier, if you remember, that suffering is something that we should all be prepared for, whether it's physical or it's persecution, maybe mockery, or even false accusations. But if you are suffering for something that you deserve, there's no glory in that. That's what's called doing your time. If you endure something because of something that you did, that's not considered suffering for the Lord. That's what we call punishment. I always find a list of sins given, for example, in passages like this interesting. And we know that these lists of sins are never complete. What Peter, Paul, and others list are only the sins that, not the only sins intended, but it's understood that these are just a few of many examples, but I don't ever recall ever seeing troublesome meddler in any of these lists before. It makes me think of the bad guy getting unmasked on the old Scooby-Doo cartoons. I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for you meddling kids. One has to wonder if the reason that Peter included this troublesome meddler next to things normally listed like murder and theft is maybe because there was someone particular doing that just at that time that he had in mind. Maybe someone was being a busybody all up in Peter's business, or maybe he's aware of someone doing that among the body of believers that this epistle was addressed to. That may not have been intentional, but it sure makes you wonder. I want to look at verse 16 again right quick. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. Whatever you find yourself enduring for the faith, don't let it stop you from making the best of it and trying to find a way to glorify God in it. We may never face the magnitude of suffering that believers in other countries are going through right now. Even today, people are still dying or being imprisoned because of their faith in Jesus. Some people are disowned by their families for converting to Christianity. They are written off as dead by their own flesh and blood. Their families will literally hold a funeral, for in their minds, that person who has become a Christian no longer exists to them. I feel terrible for those who are enduring such things. Maybe they will find a way to serve God and to make Him known in the midst of those troubles, because we know that great rewards are awaiting those who endure this for the glory of God. The biggest things that many of us face today in this age is ridicule, slammed doors, losing a few old buddies who don't like the new you, and a few mildly worse things. But the way things are changing so rapidly in this world, as Peter said earlier, don't be surprised. You don't hear the stories on mainstream media outlets, but on Christian radio stations and other sources, you will hear of such things, and they're rapidly getting more frequent and being more intense. Not only are people here in America suffering for their faith, but their businesses and companies are being targeted in lawsuits. They're being protested. They're being canceled by a culture that is hostile to our faith. All because Christians are supposedly intolerant. Isn't that ironic? We tend to have it soft compared to other places, but the reality is it's here. It's being kept behind the curtain, but it's right here under our noses. Don't be surprised if certain inalienable rights are eradicated within your lifetime. Don't be surprised when suffering pops up unexpectedly. Instead, remember who you belong to and make whatever you're going through count for something. Have you ever just given any thought to when you'll get to meet these people of the Bible in heaven? I mean, not just the familiar names, but these suffering brothers and sisters who this letter was written to. What are we going to have to share with them? Can you imagine telling these people how scared you were that someone was going to laugh at you for your faith? I'm not sure how many of you remember hearing about the Johnstown flood that affected the state of Pennsylvania in 1889, but there's a story circulating around. It was originally told by a pastor a long time ago. I'm not sure if it's just an illustration or a true event, but this man was supposedly a survivor of this Johnstown flood. And after it was over, he told everybody he met about his experience. I survived the flood. I survived the flood of 1889. All throughout his life. Well, the story goes that once he died, he went to heaven, and he couldn't wait to tell everybody there about surviving the Johnstown flood. And upon going through the gates, he says, "Who can I tell first?" And he was told, "Go talk to that man over there. His name's Noah. I'm sure he'd like to hear about that." Can you imagine sitting next to the Apostle Paul and just thinking about what that man has endured for the faith? He gave us a list of some of those things in 2 Corinthians 11. He was whipped with the 39 lashes, I think 5 different times. He was beaten with rods 3 times. He was stoned and left for dead. He was shipwrecked 3 times. He was adrift at sea for 1 whole night and 1 whole day. He says he was in danger from robbers, from his own people on these missionary journeys. He was in danger from the Gentiles, in danger from false brothers. He had spent many sleepless nights. Paul was often hungry and thirsty, cold and exposed, and he was even snake bit after swimming to shore from a shipwreck in freezing water. A serpent come out and fastened itself to his hand as he was trying to get warm and dry off. And yet, given his God-centered worldview, Paul calls all of this suffering light and momentary. Now, what are you going to say when Paul asks, what about you? What did you endure in your life? We made fun of the blunders Peter made as a disciple, the many times that he put his foot in his mouth, or the denials of Christ. That is not the same Peter that we are seeing here in this epistle, and that was definitely not the fellow believer that we're seeing here that's also going to end up on a cross, just like Jesus predicted. In light of all that Peter went through and all of these others, are our problems or fears still so big? Are we going to sit in the midst of these men and women of the faith who endured so much from Nero and tell them that we were too scared or ashamed to even speak about Jesus to people, all while we're living in a country that doesn't murder people for the faith yet? In 1895, when Amy Carmichael was a young woman, she moved away from her home to Ireland to South India. Once there, she served for 55 years without ever returning to her home. For the last 20 years of her life, Amy Carmichael was bedridden and in great pain. She had accidentally fell into an uncovered pit. And in that time, she managed to write several books about all of her journeys, but one poem of hers has stuck with me for years. And it came to mind as I read these verses and thought about meeting these persecuted believers from centuries past. It's called Hast Thou No Scar? It says, no hidden scar on foot or side or hand. I hear thee sung as mighty in the land. I hear them hail thy bright ascendant star, but hast thou no scar? Hast thou no wound? Yet I was wounded by the archers spent, leaned me against a tree to die and rent. By ravening beasts that compassed me I swooned. Hast thou no wound? No wound, no scar? Yet as the master shall the servant be, and pierced are the feet that follow me. But thine are whole. Can you have followed far, who has no wound and no scar? All of a sudden, those fears that hold us back from serving God sound pretty small, don't they? Let's continue on in verses 17 through 19. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is with great difficulty that the righteous are saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Now, verse 17 reminds us that God disciplines those who are His. We should count spiritual discipline as a blessing, for we know that we are His children. You don't discipline children who are not yours. Now, after several hours at a laundromat watching some other people's children being wild and rude and flat out disrespectful and cussing, sometimes you want to discipline other people's children. I posted on Facebook one time that there was this kid in a Lowe's lumberyard who just kept calling me fat and saying all of these other things. So I posted on Facebook, I said, whoever this kid belongs to, you can find him inside the red washing machine on aisle 11. Of course, I didn't really stuff a kid in there, but if you're honest, there's times when you wonder why folks let their kids get away with so many things. Sometimes you might wonder why God lets people get away with things too. Why faithful believers can suffer at the hands of evil people, but yet believers receive discipline at times. It's because we are His children and they are not. That's why. When Jesus spoke to some unbelievers who were attacking Him verbally, He gave this reply in John 8:44. You are of your father the devil, and you do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Being disciplined by God is sometimes necessary, and it can be painful, but as verse 18 said, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? He said we were saved with great difficulty. We barely made it, and it wasn't because of anything that we did. Jesus paid the debt that we owed on the cross. That's it. By faith, we cling to Him and we give Him the rest of our life. But He did what we could not do. In 1 Peter 4:19 it says, "Therefore, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right." That can be a hard verse. According to that, sometimes we suffer according to the will of God. It might be to shape us. It might come in the form of discipline, and it may be just to make us stronger for something that is to come. And like Job, we may never know why on this side of eternity. Paul prayed 3 times for something that was ailing him. He called it a thorn in the flesh, and we don't really know what it was. And God did not remove it. Now listen to me now. God does hear each and every prayer of His children, but sometimes the answers to our prayers are no or not yet. God didn't remove what troubled Paul, but He assured Paul that he was still in control, and he had his reasons. In 2 Corinthians 12, verses 8 and 9, he says, "Concerning this I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And He said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me." Now, I'm sure this comes as no surprise to you, but there are times when God just doesn't make sense. Sometimes He'll answer prayers while I'm still praying them, and sometimes much later than when I wanted. But looking back, His timing was exactly right according to His timetable. Sometimes the answer to your prayer may be no, and sometimes the answer might be something that's completely opposite of what you prayed for. Now, this troubles a lot of people, and some of them actually lose their faith when things like that happen. They will tell you that, "Oh, I chose to walk away from the faith when such and such happened." That is not true trusting faith. How can you walk away from something that you never really had? You know, as a kid, there were a great many decisions that my parents made that made no sense to me at the time. You know, I was a kid. I knew everything after all, right? Or so I thought. Then I got into high school. Many of my teachers said things that didn't make any sense to me. After all, as a teenager, I knew more about the world than these college-educated teachers, right? You know, we tend to think that we know how God should do things. We think that we know how this world should be run. But we forget that He made this world and everything in it. We did not. What do we really know about running things? You know, we tried to take control of the reins of the world back in the Garden of Eden and do things our way instead of the way that God said. And we're still paying for that. I think God knows more about how things should be run than I do. So in verse 19 says, "We shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right." You know, we have the motto on our coins that says, "In God we trust." And then we lock up that same money out of sight. We have safe deposit boxes, all these complex locks on our doors, and even safes in our homes for our valuables. You know, crime has gotten so bad in the rural areas that I don't even like leaving my house empty when I go anywhere for fear that I'm going to be broken into again. My big dogs that I have, they're a really big help. Not because they're ferocious, because they've chewed up and pooped on anything of value that I have. There's nothing left that can be stolen. But you can do all of these steps to try to secure your belongings, but what can a man do with his soul? What could we possibly do about our home in heaven? Not a thing ourselves. I choose to trust in the God that created me, and He created you and everything else. You know, it's fun to sing the old song, "He's got the whole world in His hands," but it's so comforting to know that He also has you and I in His hands. Sorry, Allstate, but God is better at this.